Okay, so hello again and welcome to everyone here uh, in this our online lecture series. Um, and our speaker today is Professor Stephan HAUSER, and he will talk about Charax, the capital of Mesene and the Arsacid center of trade. And of course, Charax is a very well-known city in southern Mesopotamia, and most of the Iraqi actually scholars or ordinary people they have heard about it more, and we all actually we need to know more about this great site. So, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to these ARVA lectures. You know, it's always, it appears always a little bit more informal if we are not sitting here in the same room all together face to face. And I hope I can still transport what I want to say about the site of Charax Spasinou, which really is a marvelous site, as you will see. And I hope I don't promise too much if I say that this is one of the most fantastic sites I've ever seen, even though it doesn't look particularly assuming, as you can see from the image in my back. If you still have your feature me as well on the side screen, and what you can also see in the first image of the talk. But let me first situate the site itself and its history. So let's see whether it works. I hope it does, and it should really. Okay, here we go. Sorry, I have to clean my screen here a bit. So remove that part here. Okay, that's better. So, well, let us start with the person who came up with the idea to create a city at the spot where we more recently started to work at a site called Charax Spasinou, or Jebel Khayaber, as it is currently called. But then neither name was the first name given to the site. Instead, the first name was Alexandria on the Tigris. And the start for the development of the city came with the conquest of Alexander of the Achaemenid Empire. He moved his troops up to the site of Patala on the Indus before he decided to split them, and he himself returned via Gedrosia, as the region was called in antiquity, overland through steppes and deserts and mountains to Susa, while his admiral, commander of his fleet, Nearchos, ventured to sail all along the southern coast of Persia to the Persian Gulf, entered the Persian Gulf, and then finally met Alexander at Susa, which, as you will remember, was the main capital among the capitals of the Achaemenid Empire. So they met up there, and Alexander decided to move on to Babylon, and on the way back from Susa, along the Tigris, the Karun, you will later see why I say Karun, Karha, river, the Elamais, they came to the spot where Alexander decided to create a new harbor, a new port city for the Persian Gulf, before they continued upwards along the Euphrates to Babylon, where Alexander died about half a year later. Okay. The I hope you can see everything on the screen. And, but why? The question is, why did Alexander decide to create a new port city? Why was it needed? So we have to think about I'm sorry, someone, I'm constantly irritated. Someone has his mic on and there are voices coming. Sorry. Okay, thank you very much for muting. So the situation was that the riverine system had changed tremendously. I tried on this map to indicate the former extent of the Persian Gulf, and you can see that it reached far more north than at the time of Alexander. And the phenomenon is already described by Plinius in his Natural History, and he says that there has been no land which has been altered as fast by the load of earth and sand carried by rivers, and that there is no other region where the land has been moved forward as fast and intensely as here. So we can see this, and Jaffa knows this far better than I do, that indeed in the last centuries BCE, the entire region of southern Mesopotamia, of southern Babylonia, I should say, was changed, and that the swamps moved, and that probably the Euphrates was not well navigable anymore. And especially a new harbor was needed for the trade between India and Babylonia. So this is the reason a new city, Alexandria, on the Tigris was built, which also at the same time had exactly the same situation like Alexandria on the Nile, as it connected the open sea and the riverine system and via the riverine system, all these major cities in Babylonia. As Pliny explains to us, the city was built and to the point where the Elamais met the Tigris River on artificial plateau. And as you can see here on this map, not only based on, but provided by previous research by Belgian colleagues who worked in the 1990s and 2000s in Iran, there is a certain paleo channel, the K2 channel, which probably combined the waters of the Karun and the Karha at this time. And this is where just on the left of the screen, you can see Spasinou Charax, which joined the Tigris, which was flowing north-south at this point here. So returning to Pliny, the site was first founded by Alexander the Great, but the rivers destroyed, as Pliny reports, the city, and it was later rebuilt by Antiochus, so-called the fifth of the kings, and named after him. Problem with the fifth of the kings is probably, that the fifth of the Seleucids is not called Antiochus, and therefore there is some debate about who this Antiochus mentioned here really was. The common opinion is that it was Antiochus the fourth, while I believe it's Antiochus the third. Sorry, but anyway, after the city was destroyed again, it was rebuilt by Spausinus, and that's where the name Spasinou Charax comes from, the son of Sakdonakos, king of the neighboring Arabs. who created ramparts for its protection in a length of 6 miles and hardly less width. The process of the continued upload of additional sand and clay is described by Pliny in the next passage, in which he relates that when the city was founded, it was just 10 states, so 18.5 kilometers away from the coast. And that during his time already, so just 400 years later, the Arab envoys and merchants from Rome, from the Roman Empire, who had been there, relate that it was now 120 miles or 180 kilometers away from the littoral. And then the passage I quoted already follows in Pliny's report. So a summary of the city's history is given in this slide here. Founded by Alexander, and then rebuilt by Antiochus, I think the third, rebuilt again by Hyspaosines. Then it became at his death or around his death, the city became incorporated into the Arsacid Empire, better known as Parthian, and I prefer Arsacid for certain reasons. Then the city became known as Charax Spasinou or Charax de Mesene in Palmyrene inscriptions, and it became known as a center of trade. Oh, misspelled here, I'm sorry, I will replace this. Conquered by Vologases III, King of Kings in 151, and you will see how we know this. And in 410, it will have lost much of its former importance, because we see that the metropolite of the Christian church within the Sasanian Empire, the metropolite of Mesene, resides in Forat, so Prat Maishan, 18 kilometers to the south, and not in Charax Maishan anymore, even though it's still mentioned as a bishopric, and the bishop from Charax Maishan is also present in the gatherings of the bishops in Ctesiphon until the 9th century. So from the 9th century onwards, we don't hear about Charax and Forat anymore in any written sources. I already mentioned that the area where the bishops resided was called Maishan, and the city itself was called Charax Maishan or Charax Maishan. And this, of course, disagrees with what the region is usually called in literature, because the region south of Babylonia, in especially the history of the ancient historians, is usually called Charakene. There is this major study on the Charakene by Monika Schul, her PhD thesis published in 2000, in which she collects all the various sources provided in Latin, Greek, Palmyrene, Aramaic, in Persian, in Arabic, and several other languages. And if we look at all these sources she provides, we see that the term Charakene is only used twice, by Ptolemy and by Pliny, and both refer to Charakene as a landscape in connection with topographical descriptions. And for them, Charakene is part of the landscape of Susiana. So it belongs basically to Susa. But this is just a geographical description. In all the other sources, regardless of what language they were written in, the region itself is called Mesene or Maishan. Therefore, the region, and especially in political context, we should call Mesene. Mesene, in turn, is an integral and important part of the Arsacid Empire. And I show you the various regions, satrapies, we could call it, of the Arsacid Empire, even though the official denomination for these regions is kingdoms within the Arsacid Empire. That's also why the King of Kings is aptly named. Mesene has one of the mints of the empire, and the mints of Mesene, Elamais, and Babylonia produce tetradrachms as main denomination. The other areas in the Iranian realm use drachms as their main denomination. We will return to that later on. Still, in literature, there is much debate about the exact relation between Mesene and the King of Kings, and this is also an important debate in connection with the general idea about the internal structure of the Arsacid Empire, as is usually assumed, a very weak entity, or as I would prefer, rather strong, but somehow decentralized empire, really. So a major argument in the whole debate is this bronze Heracles, which you can see in the museum in Baghdad. And it was found in 1980 in Seleucia, unfortunately not during an excavation, but by accident. On the legs of this Heracles, you can see in an inscription, and there are two versions, a Greek and a Parthian version, and both report the same, that Arsakis Vologases, the King of Kings, the son of King Mithridat, fought against Mithridat of Maishan, who was the son of the King of Kings, Pakoras. And he conquered Maishan in the year 151 CE. Well, this opened up a whole debate, and the first who formed an opinion here were prominent names like Bowersock, Bernard, and Potter, who thought that the independence of Mesene is demonstrated by its right to issue coins, and also by the war between the Vologases and Mithridat, we know from the Heracles statue. And in addition, Bowersock specifically tried to argue that Mesene must have been independent because Trajan was friendly greeted by Mesene and its king Atambelos, that Mithridates was probably enthroned by Trajan and Hadrian, although there is no evidence at all. This is just an assumption. And the missing link between all these assumptions is that the Palmyrines are important arbiters and should be seen as agents for Roman interests in Mesene. Unfortunately, the evidence points to something entirely different, if you ask me. So even though we do have honorary inscriptions from Palmyra, which report to the existence of a Palmyrene community and Palmyrene merchants in Charax Spasinou, the fact that one of those Palmyrenes was assigned the position of administrator of Thulusa, modern Bahrain, by Mithridates in the year 131, is not evidence for Roman influence on Mesene. We still have to to understand that between the eastern border of the Roman Empire and the western border of Mesene, we have a distance of about 1,000, of more than actually 1,000 kilometers. And it would have been difficult for the Romans to help Mesene to remain independent against the pressure of the Arsacid king of kings, as Bowersock assumed. On the other hand, it is a very, very common fact from many different cultures, periods, regions, that rulers tend to trust in people or to entrust people also with administrative measures who don't have their power base at home. And in this case, it might have been a very good idea to entrust someone from Palmyra with the administration of parts of the Persian Gulf, as he must have been, or probably was at least, a merchant, also involved in the India trade at the time. What I think Bowersock is referring to, and I think we would be mistaken if we would believe the argument, is that the argument runs exactly along the same line, that if we see that Arnold Schwarzenegger, born Austrian, was the governor of California at some time, we would assume that there had been a very important specific influence by Austria and the European community in California. And to continue the argument, Bowersock's argument would make us believe that California was independent from the United States and in fact in league with the European Union. As we very well know that this is not the case, we should also be very careful in following his argument concerning the independence of Mesene from the Arsacid Empire. In fact, what we see is some internal fight about the power and within the Arsacid Empire. As I mentioned already, that the king Vologases, who fights against Meridates, was the son of another Meridates who is who has been the king of Media before, while Meridates has been the son of the king of kings, Pakoros. So Vologases is fighting his uncle, and it's probably an internal fight about the position of the king of kings, and not about the independence of Mesene. This said, the political situation explained, we finally come to the site of Charax. And as you can see on the upper end of this slide, this is what you can observe today in the landscape. There is a huge rampart, also easily visible on satellite imagery here in the north and here in the east. We don't know the western side, even though we can, especially with our geological research, reconstruct the former course of the river Tigris along this path, which I'm just indicating, and I think you can see what I'm doing here. So the site itself didn't receive much interest. This, of course, is due to the general negligence of the negligence in dealing with it, the neglect of these post-cuneiform periods in research on the ancient Near East, which prevailed for a long time. And so it took until the 1960s that John Hansman, working on his London PhD on urban settlement and water utilization in southwestern Khuzestan and southern Iraq, came across photographs in the south which showed this outline, which he tried to recreate on the map in his PhD thesis. He had immediately the idea, because this outline of walls, ramparts looked like what Pliny described, that this must be the site of Charax Spasinou. And he even ventured to visit the site of Jebel Khayaber on one afternoon from Basra, and noticing that the people in the region called the site Naisham, he thought, okay, this sounds like Maisham, and took it as an additional argument for the identification. Afterwards, there was no further research on the site, and this is quite understandable, because what you can see here is a thin yellow line provided by Google, is the international border between Iraq and Iran. The site of Jebel Khayaber, Charax Spasinou, is just 15 kilometers away from this corner here, so very close to the area. And I don't have to tell you about the very sorry history of wars in the from the 1980s onwards. So there was absolutely no way for archaeologists to work at Charax Spasinou. What you can see parallel to this international border, by the way, are several other lines which replicate the same form. All these are defensive lines created by the Iraqi military in the 1980s in the war against Iran. The war itself also showed in Jebel Khayaber. You can see that the entire rampart here is vandalized, I would like to say, by trenches, infantry trenches. And all what you see here is also the result, or most of it at least, the result of 1980s activities. And there were plenty of tank installations, etc., created. Mary Shepperson, one member of our team, and it will come to our team later on, had a study in which she counted more than 2,000 war installations in the ruin of Jebel Khayaber, and you see that we still see some of residues from the war, spoils of war, sometimes even in the ruin, but mostly outside the ruin. And we found these things, the images were taken during our survey work outside of the ruin itself, except for the head, I think. Well, for the team, you see 3 images here, and they display different campaigns, and this also explains a bit about the history of our archaeological work there. In 2016, Jane Moon, Robert Killick, and Stuart Campbell were asked by Khartan al-Abid, the then head of SBAH in Basra, whether they would be interested to visit a very fascinating ruin. And returning from Jebel Khayaber, they decided it would be a good idea to do some archaeological research in this fascinating ruin. So they applied for money with, as you can see, the British Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sports, British Council. And they were so kind a year later to appoint me as co-director for my interest in these later periods. And I could get additional funding by the German Research Foundation. We carried out several campaigns between 2017 and 2019, and we returned to the site in spring 2022, and I'm currently applying for funding with the German Research Foundation for additional campaigns starting this autumn, and I'm planning for 6 years excavation work right now. What did we do so far? You can see Stuart Campbell, who designed the survey, and Robert Killey on the survey, and Abdul Razak, one of our Iraqi team members, just carrying out some survey. And all these lines you see here, the brown ones, these are our tracks. We walked about 150 kilometers in the vicinity of the site, which you can see in blue here, to understand the landscape and to see the limitations, the limits of the site, which proves to be a 7 square kilometer large city. We found several other minor places. You can see inferred densities here indicated by heat maps, but most of these sites belong to later periods, and none of them is of major size. In addition to this, we, with the German Research Foundation money, we employed we started geological research with Jan Wallstra, who could reconstruct an ancient irrigation system to the north of Charax, primarily based on satellite imagery, but in 2022 he also had the chance to do a lot of coring in the vicinity of the site and through the entire site. We are still awaiting the final results of this research. Nevertheless, as you can see on these images, there seems to be this huge irrigation system also fanned out between the main arteries, and therefore our research also extended into the hinterland of the site itself. Returning to Charax, I just start with some fascinating element of research in southern Mesopotamia, which personally I hadn't come across before, but because of the very fine silt in the area, the very fine clay we see, we have a situation in where after rain, the walls and the areas in between walls dry up differently. So even without any excavation work, we can very often follow lines on the surface of the site. And I mentioned this right in the beginning, that the site itself is not extremely assuming. So basically it's entirely flat and you won't see very much. There are also very few sherds on the surface, but as soon as it rains, some walls show up. There are also other non-destructive possibilities to find walls, to which we come with the next slide. Here first, I would like to show that already in 2016, my dear colleagues, seeing these indications for walls, tried to put a test trench along across these walls, and could figure out that what you see on the surface is what you get beneath, as it should be. So the other major method we used on the surface of Charax was geophysical research. And this started already with a small area done by Jörg Fassbinder of Munich University in 2016, which you can see here in the center of the image. And then in later campaigns between 2017 and 2019, Stuart Campbell and his team continued to carry out geophysical work in all these other areas. We first go to area A. Later on, we move to area B and C for very short comments. So what do we see in in area A? And yeah, we sorry, I skipped this and I continue to the next slide. The other one will return later on. Already in 2016, a certain area near the bend of the river Karun, the Paleo River bed, was chosen to serve as a test area, because this is slightly mounded area with some very few sherds on the surface. And within 2 weeks work, Jörg Fassbinder could provide this fascinating image of several city blocks divided by streets, east-west streets, and a major street or even canal leading north-south. What you can also see is that we do have some, we have intense buildings and some larger buildings set atop of the other ones. And here you see a different orientation even, though this looks like we do have several faces of the city in this square here, and the same you can observe in that area. We continued in the next years, as I said, and we can conclude that the whole southern part of this 7 square kilometer site has been created in an epidemic system. So we have city blocks of 550 by 300 attic feet, so 156 to 78 meters, which is about the size of what we see in Seleucia on the Tigris, and much larger than what we see in Alexandria on the Nile or in Antiochia in Syria. This is a result of our interpretation of the geophysical work, and I don't go into any detail here. We are currently planning the final report on this work, and I hope we will proceed with this so that the publication will be available by next year. Let's return to the area explored by Jörg Fassbinder. this is again the same image I showed before, and some preliminary, we worked on this a bit more, and it changed since the preliminary interpretation by Lena Lambers of the same area. We will take a closer look now at this building here. In 2019, we had already started to with minor excavations in this area, building 5, adjacent to the street, and the idea was that we would create some chronology for the site. And here, with this building, building 1, we were interested in the question of what this slightly dented area would mean, and how the entrance side of the building would look like. So, oh yeah, sorry, I forgot. I wanted to go to building 2 first, and this is just to show you the various approaches we have to buildings without excavating. You see several drone images here, that one taken in 2016 and that one from 2017. And here we have the geophysical work, and we can combine all these images to create reconstructions of the building without even excavating, and this is what we did for a couple of buildings so far. So now we move to building 1, and I indicate the place where we excavated just a year ago, and this is the northeastern corner of building 1. You see the dented area here, and what we see once we remove just the top 5 centimeters basically of the earth, immediately beneath the surface columns appear. And these columns form a long line. We can reconstruct a colonnade, and from brick fragments on the surface of in the area, we can even be certain that the colonnade continues here. So we can clearly see bricks here, the next bricks starting there, and so on, all around this 42 by 42 meter large building. Then next to the colonnade, which forms the outer facade of the buildings, we see a wide corridor of 3 meters, and then some inner wall. And next to the wall, we see 3/4 columns attached to it, which then again have some space to further columns of the same size as the columns in the colonnade. You can already see that in between these columns in the southern part of the excavation area, we have encountered plenty of ashes. And, oh, well, just point that out, the columns here, you see forming the colonnade. These are the ones reflected in the imagery here, and to our surprise, as you might remember, in our first reconstructions, we had just drawn a line. We had expected a wall to be there, but in fact, this appears to be just the row of columns, which is also indicated in the geophysical research. So we return to the ashes here, and we have very nice and unexpected, really surprising preservation in that area. the whole site had been underwater for about 1,500 years, or at least 1,000 years on a nearly annual basis. But still, we see that in this area, even wooden beams were relatively well preserved, and palm is easy to recognize. With the other wood, we currently assume that this was a tamarisk. And the whole part of this building was destroyed by intense fire. On the very last day of our excavations last spring, of course, we came, as it always is the case in archaeological excavations, that you have the best finds on the very last days or in the middle of the side of the trench. So we came across this altar here with a very brief inscription, probably mention God. I go back to what we are planning for the next years. We will continue south from and east from where we excavated last year, and we will also continue our excavations in building 5 in that location. Let's move on to area B, and you already see in the drone imagery here that this area is characterized by some internal canal within the city. And in addition to this, we see a number of workshops with kilns. And the kilns are situated within larger buildings, which are in turn along the canal. So these are images of the kilns, and we are going to excavate there in future years. But first, in between, or in addition to our work in that area A here, we will concentrate on excavations in area C, where in drone imagery of 2017, you can clearly see some huge building of about 110 by 100 meters. And I hope you can follow that here there's a row of rooms, and there is another one down here, more clearly visible here in this image. And there's also a peristyle, which we will concentrate for a minute in that part central in the area. So we excavated in 2017 in that area here because this area had been destroyed by some bulldozer, and we just cleared it and found several columns. And then in 2018, we returned to this peristyle area here. And the situation is very much like in the other area as well. You can see Robert Killick standing here on some bricks, burnt bricks, which appeared again just beneath the surface of the site. And what you can also see here, it's still difficult to identify, but here it becomes much clearer that we do see very nicely done columns around this peristyle. The problem in the buildings for Charax is that people at Charax tried to recreate basically Mediterraneanly inspired architecture. But since the next stone would be 200 to 250 kilometers away, they tried to recreate it with the local materials available. So they used bricks and plenty of plaster, and then they put some other plaster around and created these beautifully carinated columns. This is also, the material used is also responsible for the form of the columns, I believe, because in stone architecture, you could do all these colonnades with relatively slim, round stone columns. But once you have to use this other material, it's simply too heavy to have a flat architrave. So you have to create arches for statical structural reasons. And this in turn affords a wider platform to base these arches on. So it's easily explained. It's a very ingenious way to recreate Mediterranean architecture close to the Persian Gulf. You see a preliminary first reconstruction of this peristyle, and I'm just showing you this because it's the idea is that the building looks very much like the so-called Parthian Palace at Nippur, and these two images are about the same scale. So we have about 4 times as large a peristyle as in Nippur. Concerning the finds, we have plenty of pottery from the excavations, and most of it belongs to one or another kind of the so-called BI ware, which is known all along the Persian Gulf. And it had been assumed for a long time, especially after the excavations in Failaka, that the BI ware was produced in Charax. We haven't found kilns for pottery production so far, but we are just starting with our research there. Other small finds, we have an incredible amount of nails from all places wherever we start to excavate. And they were probably used to hold the wooden structures. Then we have plenty of coins, but coins are usually terribly corroded, as you can see from these examples here, which were found in exactly the spot I showed you in the palace or palatial area. And some nice terracotta and lamp were excavated last year in Building 1. Concerning the coins, I give you an idea. This is more or less a best preserved example we found, or one of the best preserved. Most of the examples, well, this again is rather on the better preserved side, look like this. And I hope you can follow me if I say that these are hair bundles. There's a beard. There's a nose, and here are the eyes of this person. And on the back, you always have the same image. It's a seated Heracles. And in this case, we do have a date beneath the seated Heracles, which would relate to the year 149 CE. So just 1 year or 1.5 years to before the conquest of Charax by Vologases, King of Kings III. Some more images of coins from Mesene. We do have a tumulus here. We have, for the first time, the chance to work on minor denominations. And the first result is that the minor denominations from Charax have exactly the very same imagery and the very fine quality of the main denominations, the tetradrachms. Concerning the tetradrachms, this one's from our excavation. This one here is in the Bibliothèque Nationale. I do have an article in press right now, which should appear anytime soon, in a few weeks' time, I guess. And we have an incredible amount of these tetradrachms by Archambalos IV with countermarks. And you see the countermark here with a monogram. This one here is an anchor, and the anchor is the symbol for the Elamais king. And that one here, this symbol has not been sufficiently explained so far, but if Dobbins is correct, and we see an abstracted diadem here, this might even relate to the King of Kings in Babylon. And the countermark of on coins of Attambalus, which occur on hundreds of examples, about 80% of all, no, nearly 90% of all known coins of Attambalus bear these countermarks, is indicative that the coins from Mesene were accepted as legal tender in these other territories as well, which in turn refers us back to the original role assumed for Charax and Mesene when Alexander founded the city. Here is a map on the main sites in ancient long-distance trade as provided by the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And you see that most of the sites and most of the information, and accordingly also most of research on ancient long-distance trade was related to the relations between Roman Egypt and India. But the site of Charax Spasinou now opens new possibilities for us to understand the importance of the Persian Gulf trade, because Charax Spasinou was the main port or the main harbor in the beginning for the trade between India and the large cities in central Babylonia. We shouldn't forget that Pliny reports that Seleucia had a population of about 500,000 people. And even Orosius, slightly later, reports that the population was at about 400,000. In addition, we have to account for Ctesiphon, which was an ever-growing city over the centuries of the Arsacid Empire. And also Babylon was still an important place at the time. So the idea for Charax Spasinou in international trade is not, in the first place, that it was used by Palmyrines to cater for the needs of the Mediterranean Roman Empire, but basically the place where the merchants of the East meet, as the Acts of Thomas call it, was meant for the meeting place of those who catered for the needs of the population in central Babylonia. And also, we shouldn't forget that, for Susa. So Charax was the port for all these major city centers. And therefore, the idea of Alexander, when he created the city for several centuries, was completely fulfilled. The city he created, and which was rebuilt by his Pausinis, became the capital of a province and the center of long-distance trade. Thank you very much.